In September 1909, New York City threw a party to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's discovery of the Hudson River, as well as the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's introduction of steam-powered boats. The Hudson-Fulton anniversary drew thousands of visitors to the city. Two of those visitors were pioneers in the fledgling technology of aviation. Glenn Curtiss and Wilbur Wright both promised to demonstrate their self-built airplanes by flying across the harbor, past the Statue of Liberty. Curtiss failed in his attempt, his underpowered plane unable to get airborne for more than a few hundred feet. How disappointing. Wilbur Wright, inspired by a promised payment of $15,000, equivalent to $500,000 today if he completed a flight in excess of 10 miles, prepared his Wright Flyer for a journey over water by rigging a canoe between the skids normally used for landing. The top of the canoe was covered with a tightly fitted canvas cover, rendering it watertight. Wright did not intend to land on water, but he wanted to be ready in case engine failure or another mechanical issue forced him to. His preparations inadvertently resulted in, technically, the creation of the first float plane ever built. On September 29th, Wright took off from Governor's Island, flew across the harbor and around the Statue of Liberty, and returned safely to Governor's Island. On the return leg, he flew over an ocean liner departing for Europe, the Royal Mail steamer Lusitania, acknowledging the cheers from its passengers lining its decks. Pictures of the Wright Flyer passing the statue appeared in newspapers around the world. It was another of the many firsts in aviation accomplished by the Wright brothers. No other aviator had flown an airplane equipped to land on water. A few days later, he performed another flight, one of nearly 20 miles, earning the promised prize. Over 1 million New Yorkers and visitors witnessed Wilbur Wright's orbit of the Statue of Liberty in what was essentially the world's first float plane. Among them was a 10-year-old son of an affluent Wall Street banker and real estate speculator. The boy's name was Juan Trippe. Trippe was instantly smitten with all things related to flight. In less than 3 decades, he would be at the head of a company which dispatched flying boats to South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, carrying cargo, mail, and passengers in luxurious surroundings. The same harbor that witnessed Wilbur Wright's stunning achievement of 1909 would provide docking facilities for flying boats, called clippers, operated by Juan Trippe's Pan American Airways. Here is their story. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite. And today's video was a team effort between writer Larry Holsworth and Karl Smallwood with edits. So be sure to show them some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell, and check out the link in the description and pinned comment that leads to our new sister channel, About Us, where we discuss the history of businesses such as Nintendo, Blockbuster, and Pan Am, which we'll be talking about extensively in today's video. There's a video right now for you to watch, so be sure to check that out right after you've enjoyed this one. Let's get to it. Juan Terry Trippe is frequently and erroneously assumed to have been of Hispanic descent, an error encouraged by, the fact that his given name was Juan. He was not. His name was in tribute to Juanita Terry, the wife of one of his great uncles. He was born in Seabright, New Jersey, then an affluent town on the Jersey Shore in Monmouth County. His father made his living on Wall Street. Trippe went to the best schools in New York, the prestigious Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, and eventually was admitted to Yale. He also took flying lessons, learning to fly at the young age of 17. In 1917, Trippe left Yale to enlist in the United States Navy, in which he applied for flight training and the new designation of Naval Aviator. Trippe completed his flight training in June 1918. He received a commission as an ensign in the United States Naval Reserve, though the war ended before he saw any action. Post-war, Trippe was one of the millions of men who were demobilized as the United States reduced its armed forces. He returned to Yale. At Yale, he performed well in his classes, joined the famed and highly secretive Skull and Bones Society, and continued to fly whenever he could. In 1920, the National Intercollegiate Flying Association, NIFA, was formed, with Juan Trippe elected as its first treasurer. In May 1920, the NIFA held its first intercollegiate flying competition with 9 schools attending. The Yale contingent won the competition, with Juan Trippe contributing to the team's victory, flying his own Curtiss Jenny, purchased from the US Army as war surplus, which was apparently a thing you could just do back then, we suppose. Trippe graduated from Yale in 1921, having majored in business, and returned to New York to join his father on Wall Street. Yet he had already formulated the plans to enter business on his own, and it involved his first love, aviation. He maintained his contacts with Yale classmates and fraternity brothers and tapped them for investments when he started his first business, a commercial air taxi service geared toward well-heeled businessmen and investors. Its success led Trippe to acquire again, with the assistance of investors from his Yale contacts, Colonial Air Transport, which operated airmail flights between New York and Boston. He then turned his attention toward the Caribbean and South America, where lucrative airmail contracts beckoned. Pan American Airways became a shell corporation created by distinguished US Army officers to curtail the influence of a German-based airline operating in Central America. The officers, Henry Hap Arnold and Karl Spaatz, considered German aviation in the region a potential threat to the Panama Canal. Their influence within the Army led that service to leverage the awarding of mail contracts. Trippe watched these developments, and in 1927 formed the Aviation Corporation of the Americas. A year previously, Trippe, with significant financial backing, which included Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, had acquired landing rights in Havana, Cuba. And let's be honest, with a name like Cornelius Vanderbilt, you just know that guy was loaded. In 1927, the US government requested bids for airmail contracts to Cuba. The Germans, Pan Am, and Trippe's ACA all submitted bids. Pan Am won the contract to operate airmail service from Key West to Havana, but they faced 2 pretty significant problems to do that. 1, they didn't own the landing rights, and 2, they had no airplanes. Which begs the question of how in the hell they got approval in the first place, but whatever. To solve this issue in October of that year, ACA, who did have the landing rights after Trippe had managed to secure them months earlier, and Pan Am merged, along with a third company that had been created to bid on the contract, the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean Airways. The new company was known as ACA, with Pan Am a wholly owned subsidiary. Whitney, who was known as Sonny to his colleagues, became president of ACA. Juan Trippe became CEO of Pan American Airways. Hap Arnold and Karl Spaatz went on to further distinction in their Army and later Air Force careers. Pan American Airways, soon known simply as Pan Am, operated its first flight using a chartered Fairchild float plane, which took off at Key West and flew to Havana on October 19, 1927. From that inauspicious beginning, the airline grew rapidly. Trippe made numerous trips to South and Central America to expand the business, which is code for seeking out struggling local airlines and slapping them down with huge wads of cash until he owned either the business or their routes. In those early days of commercial aviation, airmail contracts, which were awarded by national governments, proved the most fruitful path to profitability. Trippe traveled throughout the region to negotiate landing rights and airmail contracts. In these endeavors, he was aided by the US government, which limited competition by treating Pan Am as a de facto flag carrier for the United States. ACA, which controlled Pan Am, became one of the most desired stocks on Wall Street in the late 1920s. As the 1930s began, Trippe used his growing prestige and influence within the aviation industry to lobby for larger, more powerful flying boats designed to fly longer distances while carrying more passengers. The Sikorsky S-38 flying boats Pan Am operated in the late 1920s carried only 8 passengers. In 1931, Sikorsky introduced the S-40 flying boat. Trippe had lobbied hard for the development of the S-40, contributing to its design. As delivered, the S-40 could carry up to 38 passengers. Only 3 S-40s were built, as Sikorsky was already developing an even larger flying boat. The 3 were the first aircraft to bear the designation of Clipper, with the first being named American Clipper when it was christened by Lou Hoover, the wife of President Herbert Hoover. The designation of the new long-distance Pan Am aircraft as Clippers came from Juan Trippe, a nod to the Clipper ships of the past, which were known for their graceful lines and great speed. The American Clipper made its first commercial flight on November 19, 1931, when it departed from Miami, Florida, bound for the Canal Zone. Charles Lindbergh, yes, that Charles Lindbergh was lead pilot, and the aircraft's designer, Igor Sikorsky, was aboard as a passenger. The route included stops in Cuba, Jamaica, and Colombia. That same year, Aviation Corporation of America changed its name to Pan American Airways Corporation. Even the new Clippers, with their larger carrying capacity and ability to fly greater distances, were not enough for Juan Trippe. He envisioned Pan Am Clipper service, which already stood for comfort and even luxury in the air, to cover the world. Trippe wanted Clippers flying across the Pacific to the Philippines, China, and Australia. He wanted Pan Am to cross the Atlantic to England and the continent, as well as North Africa, South Africa, and India. In short, Juan Trippe wanted Pan Am to cover the globe. To do this, he needed even bigger, more powerful aircraft, and he worked at acquiring them. When Juan Trippe looked at a map of the Pacific Ocean, he did not see vast expanses of open water. He saw dollar-sign-covered stepping stones his clippers could use to cross the ocean from San Francisco to the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and China. He envisioned a flight from San Francisco Bay to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, then to Midway Atoll. From Midway, the aircraft would journey to Wake Island, then to Guam, and then a final leg to Manila. Each stop would have passengers disembark the aircraft, rest and refresh themselves at a hotel while the airplane was refueled and prepared for the next leg of the journey. There were obstacles to his achieving such an ambitious goal. One was landing rights for each stop. His extensive government contracts and massive reserves of cash quickly resolved that problem, as they want to do in most situations. The other was that Midway, Wake Island, and Guam lacked the necessary facilities. Said facilities included docking and refueling stations, as well as all the amenities their clientele would expect upon landing, like hotels, restaurants, and places to buy tacky souvenirs. For Trippe to offer such services, he would have to build them. So build them he did. In 1934 and 1935, a chartered 15,000-ton freighter carried construction crews and materials to the islands Pan Am would use for its clipper service across the Pacific. At the same time, a dedicated Pan Am terminal was constructed at the Pearl City Seaplane Base on Oahu. Pan Am manned the island's stops with technicians to operate radio and navigation equipment, mechanics for the aircraft, chefs, waiters, concierges, innkeepers, housekeepers, launderers, and other workers to care for the passengers during their brief stays. A clipper journey was a first-class journey, both aboard the aircraft and while on the ground. It was targeted to those who would otherwise travel via the great ocean liners of the day, and both the service and the price reflected it. When service opened, a one-way trip from San Francisco to Manila cost $950, equivalent to about $20,000 in today's money. Still, that price included overnight stays in Hawaii, Midway Atoll, Wake Island, and Guam, all meals for the 6-day journey, and luxury seating in the airplane. To Pan Am and its employees, it wasn't first-class service, it was clipper service. So what did clipper service actually mean in practice? Well, customers could expect to be waited on hand and foot by immaculately dressed stewardesses who'd provide food and drink in abundance, all served on the finest china and cooked fresh in the air, or at least from 1935 onwards, when the technology was invented to allow them to do so. Customers would also enjoy in-flight entertainment in the form of games and reading materials, also provided by the airline. The first clipper flight across the Pacific departed San Francisco in another type of flying boat, the Martin M130, but known to the passengers as the China Clipper. The Martin boats, designed for the trans-Pacific flights, carried up to 12 passengers. The Martin flying boats carried the service until 1939, when they were joined by Boeing 314 flying boats. The Boeings were the pinnacle of the flying boats, and as Pan Am Clippers, they were the epitome of luxury in air travel. The Boeing 314 was partitioned in the passenger compartment into 5 standard compartments, each of which could be configured to sleep either 10 or 6 passengers. There was also a separate compartment known as the deluxe compartment, which included a small sofa, a love seat, a writing desk, and a wardrobe. Oh, and a sink. The passenger area also included men's and women's restrooms, equipped with hot and cold running water and electrical outlets. The dining room could be configured in varying table setups, depending on the number of passengers at each sitting. Tablecloths were fine linen, glassware was of cut crystal, dishes of fine china, marked with Pan Am's logo. Cutlery was heavy sterling silver. Meals were served by trained waiters. High tea was served from a sterling silver tea set. One notable aspect of Pan Am's flights that remains a standard in the airline industry to this day was the idea of giving stewardesses and later stewards a recognizable uniform. Vaguely militaristic in appearance, these uniforms were tailored to fit each wearer perfectly and give them a sleek, professional appearance. Perhaps the most recognizable detail, and the one that continues to be a hallmark of the profession, was the inclusion of color-coordinated accessories. In the earliest days of the airline, the accessories were limited to a hat and gloves, but around the 60s began outfitting stewardesses with scarves. A stylistic choice many other airlines would come to emulate, to the point air hostess scarves are like a thing now. While the overall look of stewardesses changed over the years, with Pan Am eventually tailoring the uniform to reflect their literal global reach, one aspect that remained consistent was the color. Blue, or to be more specific, Pan Am Blue, a color created specifically for the airline to be both evocative of naval uniforms, thereby projecting an aura of authority, but also colorful to catch the eye and ensure that a Pan Am employee always stood out when strolling through the airport. To this end, when rival airlines became a thing, Pan Am began employing the services of world-renowned designers to ensure that their stewardesses were always at the cutting edge of fashion. Likewise, pilots on Pan Am flights stood out and, at Trippe's behest, wore immaculately tailored outfits largely inspired by naval uniforms, a trend that similarly lasts to this day, though unlike with stewardesses, the looks of which changed with the times to reflect the fashion and sensibilities towards dress of the time. Pilots have pretty much always worn some variation of a dark navy-inspired uniform, usually sporting things like epaulettes and, of course, a cool hat bearing the airline's logo. Back to the planes, the arrival of the Boeing 314 flying boats allowed Pan Am to expand transatlantic service in the late 1930s, and as it had across the Pacific, the company built facilities to accommodate their routes. A new Pan Am terminal opened in Lisbon in 1939, allowing Pan Am to connect it from Baltimore via the city of Horta in the Azores. In early 1939, Clipper service from Port Washington, Pan Am's Long Island, New York terminus at the time, to Marseille, France, via Horta and Lisbon was introduced. The Clippers, which continued to fly into Lisbon during World War II during the period of US neutrality, became international symbols of the United States. The service they provided was unmatched, yet Juan Trippe was still not satisfied. Throughout its first decade, Pan Am was run by Juan Trippe. Officially as CEO, he was answerable only to the board of directors. Unofficially, he answered to nobody, and the board was stocked with loyalists who did his bidding. In terms of miles flown, by the 1930s, Pan Am was the largest airline in the world. It was one of the wealthiest and most powerful corporations in America, and Juan Trippe, one of the world's most powerful businessmen. Airline manufacturers and designers bowed to his demands. So did the Civil Aviation Board, which actively discouraged direct competition with Pan Am by other American carriers. Yet there were cracks in the armor, among them a series of years in which low dividends were paid on shares held by investors. In early 1939, the board revolted, removing Trippe as CEO and installing Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, one of the company's founders and one of Trippe's closest friends, in his stead. Trippe was retained as president, but the board enacted a new company hierarchy in which Trippe clearly reported to Whitney. Trippe was furious at the move. When Whitney took over, seemingly just to be a relocated into Trippe's former office, moving the then former CEO to a smaller office down the hall with what we assume was a crappier view. Major decisions were deferred to an executive committee, with Whitney signing off on their decision. Trippe was, for the time being, no longer running what he viewed as his airline. When World War II began in Europe in September 1939, Whitney announced to the board of directors that he would step down as CEO in order to concentrate his time on his diverse other activities. He recommended that the board combine the duties of president and CEO into one office, in essence suggesting that the board reinstate Trippe as CEO. The board complied, and Trippe reoccupied his old office in the Chrysler Building, where Pan Am kept its headquarters. Though Whitney had, in the end, played a role in Trippe returning as CEO, he never again held Trippe's trust or friendship. Nor did Trippe forget the role played by some members of the board, biding his time during the war years before purging several members he considered disloyal from the board. Instead, he consolidated his power and his support on the board of directors, abolished the executive committee's decision-making authority, and returned to running his airline his way. Pan Am continued to grow during the war years, expanding operations in Africa and the Middle East, in the South Pacific, and especially in South and Central America. Several of its flying boats were lost, some in accidents, some in military operations. Yet, the airline continued to prosper during the war and was well positioned in the post-war years for additional growth. Although the flying boats attempted to return to operation briefly, their day had passed. Advances in land-based aircraft, including longer ranges, pressurization of cabins, and increased carrying capacities, had rendered the flying boats obsolete. Without the flying boats, Pan Am no longer needed its global network of seaplane terminals, and most were sold to local governments or military units. Some, such as the Marine Terminal at New York's LaGuardia Airport, were simply shut down. The Pan Am facility in San Francisco was absorbed into the new international airport constructed there. The US government's view of Pan Am shifted as well. Once recognized as America's unofficial flag carrier to be protected from competition, Pan Am found the government and the Civil Aviation Board actively urging competition. Pan Am faced competition for its South American and Caribbean routes from Braniff. Northwest Airlines challenged its domination of routes to the Orient, while United began to dominate routes to Hawaii. But it was the transatlantic competition which irked Juan Trippe the most. There, Pan Am found itself challenged by Trans World Airlines, known as TWA, and its eccentric yet brilliant head, Howard Hughes. At one point in 1962, Trippe decided to resolve the ongoing feud with Hughes by merging Pan Am with TWA, a plan which would have created a huge airline and corporation, but it ultimately fell through. As land-based aircraft took over the overseas routes with several refueling stops lengthening the journeys, both airlines looked for ways to attract customers. Pan Am still labeled its aircraft as Clippers, though the Clipper service of the pre-war days was considerably less plush. Dining lounges vanished, replaced by meals served to passengers in their seats. There were still sleeping berths available on some flights. Dinner service still included chef-prepared meals, though the silver cutlery and full table settings vanished into the past. Still, all the airlines took pride in their amenities. In 1948, Trippe stood the industry on its ear by announcing a rate plan which boasted not of the services it provided, but rather those it did not provide. That same year, taking advantage of the larger passenger capacities of the new land-based aircraft such as the DC-4 would carry up to 60 passengers, Trippe announced a certain number of seats per flight would be sold as tourist class, with less service and amenities, but cheaper fares. Pan Am eventually named its tourist class rates Rainbow Fares. Some flights could be designated entirely tourist class. At the same time, a higher level of service was announced for some flights, which Pan Am called President's Class. The rest of the industry cried foul, protesting that the move would initiate a price war before all the major airlines gradually mimicked the practice when they realized they could similarly charge through the nose by price gating certain amenities. A practice airlines have continued to this very day, by the way, coming up with ever more elaborate ways to charge customers for things that used to come as standard. Our favorite example of this being the British airline Ryanair, who briefly toyed with the idea of charging customers for the luxury of taking a crap on one of their planes. No, we're not kidding. But that's a story for another day, perhaps on our sister channel, About Us. And Karl says that he will write about Ryanair because they're famous for stuff like that. So, look forward to that eventually. Juan Trippe and Pan Am considered purchasing the de Havilland Comet, the first commercial jetliner, when it was introduced in 1952. Ultimately, they passed on the aircraft. It proved to be a wise decision, as the Comet was plagued with several crashes, which led to the aircraft being withdrawn and extensively redesigned. Instead, Pan Am held out to purchase a plane from a company that was, and of course still is, known for the quality and craftsmanship of their planes: Boeing. Karl, was that sarcastic enough? Specifically, Pan Am wanted the Boeing 707, purchasing the first 20 of the 4-engine jetliner and the DC-8. Pan Am initiated jet service from New York's Idlewild Airport, now known as JFK International, to Paris in 1958 using the new 707. Juan Trippe was an early and avid supporter of Boeing's widebody 747, ordering the first 25 in April 1966. Its first 747 flight took place in 1970, making Pan Am the first airline to operate widebody airliners commercially. The 747 saw multiple fare schedules per route. Its large capacity allowed several classes, with varying degrees of services, both in the air and on the ground. Trippe also introduced numerous innovations in reservations and ticketing, commissioning IBM to develop and build the Panamac computer to handle its bookings, including flights, hotel reservations, ground transportation, and other services for customers. The computer occupied an entire floor of the Pan Am building in Manhattan, the largest commercial office building in the world in 1964. Today, it is the MetLife building. Pan Am also built its jetport at JFK International, an immediately iconic structure totally dedicated to jet travel and the then new jet age. Juan Trippe retired as president and CEO of Pan Am in 1968, having served as the de facto head of the airline since its founding, other than the 8 months when he was temporarily replaced by Sonny Whitney. That same year, the power and prestige of the airline were reflected by the prominent use of the Pan Am spaceplanes depicted in the motion picture 2001: A Space Odyssey. Unfortunately, the prediction of Pan Am continuing to thrive in the 21st century proved to be a bit too optimistic. In retirement, Trippe continued to attend board meetings for the airline and maintained an office in the Pan Am building. He left behind a company which was widely considered the world's premier airline, as well as the International Hotels Corporation, which he founded in 1946 to increase business activity in key cities in South America, a project first proposed by President Roosevelt before World War II. Trippe came to believe that increased business activity in South America would create more business for Pan Am. Today, that company lives on as Intercontinental Hotels and Resorts. Pan American World Airways does not. Beginning in the late 1970s and during the remainder of the 20th century, the company suffered numerous difficulties. Deregulation, terrorist bombings, heavy competition, rising fuel costs, and an aging fleet were all contributing factors in the airline's demise. Pan Am ceased operations in December 1991. There have been attempts to revive the brand, though to date all have failed. This said, in June of 2025, there is supposedly going to be a celebration of sorts where a Pan Am plane will once again soar into the sky and retrace the steps of the company's earliest planes across the Atlantic, with tickets going for about $60,000. Between Wilbur Wright's 1909 flight around the Statue of Liberty and Juan Trippe's retirement, a mere 59 years elapsed. In 1970, 2 years after Juan Trippe's retirement, Pan Am flew 16.4 million passenger miles. Under his guidance, Pan Am grew to operate scheduled flights to all 6 continents of the globe. It never, in Trippe's lifetime, developed any domestic routes in the United States, one of the factors which contributed to its collapse in the 1980s. But it became and remained the standard by which all other international airlines were judged, especially in the early days of the jet age. Juan Trippe did not live to see the demise of his beloved airline. He suffered a stroke in 1980, which ended his days of going to his Manhattan office. Another stroke in April 1981 led to his death. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Juan Trippe the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. He is regarded as one of the great pioneers of commercial aviation in the world, and one of the greatest entrepreneurs of the 20th century. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment your favorite places to fly, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell if you haven't. And be sure to check out our new sister channel, About Us, which covers the history of businesses. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.